Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is David Ciccone. I'm an associate professor of political science here at George Washington University and co-director of PONAR's Eurasia. We at PONARS are proud to organize the New Voices on Eurasia speaker series. New Voices have been around for almost 6 or 7 years, and it brings some of the young, new, up-and-coming scholars on Eurasia more broadly to Washington, D.C. to share their research for a broader audience. It covers comparative politics, international relations, economics, sociology, across the disciplines. We like to have a broad, diverse approach. And we're thrilled today to welcome Delgerjargal Uvsh. How bad did I do?
You did pretty well.
Trust me, with someone with an unpronounceable last name, I know the pain. From the University of Texas at Austin. Delgerjargal recently started as an assistant professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, but with courtesy appointments at the Department of Government and the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. She received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has just a really vibrant and dynamic research agenda on natural resources, political economy of Russia, and also today with sanctions, so applying some of the research to some current dynamics in the region. Well, we're thrilled to offer the podium to Delgerjargal this afternoon to share some of her research and her findings. She'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, then we'll have the rest of the time for question and answer, both from the people here in person and also from the many people who have joined us online. Welcome. Please share your questions in the chat, and we'll try to cover as many as we can in the time following the talk. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here and the audience online as well. It's my honor to be here today. So I will start the talk with a note that my research interest in general is more broadly about how natural resource-rich governments deal with declines in their natural resource revenues rather than sanctions themselves. I am writing a book on this broad question of what do resource-dependent governments do when they experience decline in their natural resource revenues. So I will talk about my book manuscript a little bit and the relevant case of Russian regions a little bit. And I will then go through the framework that I developed in the book that I hope is helpful for us to understand what's happening in Russia in face of sanctions. And then we will go over the overview of general and most significant sanctions that has been imposed on Russia's oil and gas sector, how that seemed to be affecting the federal revenues and expenditures. And then we will use the theoretical framework from the book to analyze the various options that the Russian government has and how the government is actually or seeming to be strategizing in face of these actions. So my book asks the question of when do negative revenue shocks or decline in natural resource revenues lead governments to make positive changes, particularly in economic policies. So very broadly, the book engages with what's called the resource curse literature, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which basically describes the idea that countries that have a lot of natural resources paradoxically perform poorer on economic, social, and political outcomes. The main focus of this body of literature seems to have been mostly on understanding the effect of increases in natural resource revenues. So what happens when countries receive windfall revenues from exploiting their oil, coal, gold, and so on. But we know relatively little about what happens when natural resource revenues decline. So my goal with this book is to answer the question of what happens after the resource curse in a resource-rich country. I have several cases in the book, but probably most interesting and relevant for the audience here today is the cases of Russia's oil and gas producing regions. So Russia, as you know, is one of the largest oil and gas producers, but the production and exploitation of oil and gas is spread across the territory of Russia. So out of the 80 plus regions, about 34 produce some level of oil and gas. And I examined how these 34 regions have reacted to two instances of what I call negative revenue shock or decline in natural resource revenues. To kind of overview what I find in the cases of Russian regions, the first negative revenue shock happened in 2002, and this is actually an important development for where Russia is now. So before 2002, the oil and gas producing regions in Russia kept about 60% of the revenues that came from oil and gas exploitation. But in 2002, the system was centralized. So now almost all oil and gas revenue goes to Moscow as opposed to being in the regions. So this is a case of a very significant long-term negative revenue shock that the Russian regions faced, as a result of which they experienced significant declines in their overall government revenues. In 2014, they experienced another negative revenue shock as a result of decline in commodity prices. So again, their budgets went down, but the cause was very different. So we can talk about methods if there's any interest in how I studied these regions in Q&A. But the main finding here is that in the case of centralization of revenues in 2002, regional governments, initially they fought back. They submitted a proposal in the Federation Council, for instance, where the regional representatives assemble, right, to reverse decentralization. Some attempt to boycott the 2003 State Duma election in reaction to decentralization, but eventually they failed and realized, okay, this is a long-term reality we have to deal with. So on average, what these regions ended up doing is they took a long-term approach to solve their decline in natural resource revenues. As a result, they adopted policies to make doing business easier for businesses in their regions. They provided more tax incentives and so on. But this didn't happen in 2014. So in 2014, these regions have seen this decline in oil and gas revenues or negative revenue shocks as something temporary. It was described as part of the global commodity boom and bust, right? So if we just hang on for a little bit, then we'll be okay. The money is coming back in, was the mindset. So I argue that that's why they took this short-term approach where instead of supporting the private sector, the regional governments actually took resources away from them. There's more reports of corruption, inspection, interference from the state, and so on. So this case, in combination with other cases in the book, gives me this framework to analyze how governments react to negative revenue shocks or declines in their natural resource revenues. So this is where we want Russia to find itself, right? That's the goal of these sanctions, to have them experience significant negative revenue shocks. So what I find is that generally governments have the option of increasing production of the main resource that they rely on. But they usually, it's very difficult to do in the short run. They try to reduce expenditure, but it's also difficult. So eventually, generally, these governments are left with two options, either to divest away from businesses or engage in corrupt activities, basically weaken the private sector, or they can try to expand the tax base, and that is, for example, the case of 2002 centralization. So I argue that for governments to make this decision between these two strategies, expectation of how long the negative revenue shock is going to happen is important. So when governments expect the decline in revenues to be short-term, they're more likely to divest from businesses, whereas when they expect a long-term shock, they are more likely to engage in more long-term constructive activities. And that's what happened in 2002. So to kind of contextualize the 2002 case, it's important to know about that because now Russia finds itself in a very centralized revenue system as a result of that reform. And also, even though this was, Putin's part of Putin's early attempts to centralize power, the unintended consequences for the regions was that the regions have kind of reversed the resource curse situation they found themselves in. Okay, so how does this framework apply to the post 2022 Russia, specifically when it comes to federal government revenues, right? So the main takeaway from the talk, or the argument I'm making here, is that natural resource revenues are slowly and incrementally declining as a result of sanctions, but Russia is not going for the first two options laid out under this framework. So they're not increasing production or reducing expenditure. Between these two options, however, Russia seems to be going for taking away resources from the private sector, increasing the interference and influence of the government in the business, rather than expanding the tax base. And there are a couple of reasons that I'm gonna talk about, but that's the kind of main takeaway of the talk. So looking into the current situation, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world right now, with over 16,000 specific sanctions imposed on them. The ones that are most relevant to reducing Russia's revenues and cutting its ability to wage war in Ukraine is, of course, cutting natural resource revenues. The notable sanctions for this end include the price cap sanctions on seaborne oil, which went into effect in December 2022, implemented by the EU and G7 nations. Similarly, there is a price cap sanction from the EU and G7 on premium Russian oil products at $100 per barrel, and for discounted products, $45 per barrel. Gas is relatively less sanctioned. So the US and Canada banned Russian gas imports early on, but their imports from Russia was minuscule, so it wasn't really meaningful. One of the biggest consumers of Russian gas used to be Europe, of course. EU has allowed, or is allowing, its member states now to unilaterally ban Russian gas. It has done a lot to undercut its reliance on Russian gas. Russia contributed to this action as well when it cut off supplies to some European countries, such as Bulgaria, in retaliation of their support for the Ukrainian government rather than Russia. So overall, these sanctions, have they had effect or not? You may have seen reports in some newspapers, which is basically saying that, well, despite the sanctions, the oil and gas revenues and the federal revenues in Russia are increasing, right? So that's probably based on looking at the nominal figures. So if we only look at how much money is coming into Russian federal state coffers, then this is the picture we see. And over here in orange, we see the overall federal revenues. In blue, we see the oil and gas revenues. And generally, when we look at just the numbers, it's trending up, right? But if we're interested in understanding what type of trade-offs these kind of actions are requiring the Russian government to do, we have to look beyond the nominal numbers. So relative or normalized terms tell us a little bit more. So in this graph, for example, we see the annual revenues of Russian federal government as percentage of GDP. And what we see here is that there is a slight decline since 2021 in federal revenues as percentage of GDP. So this may not seem like a lot, but when we contextualize it in global commodity markets, we're actually looking at more of a best case scenario for Russia because the prices of oil and relevant commodities are relatively high, right? So when Russia experienced similar decline in federal revenues after 2014, this was the worst case scenario for Russia, but this decline in the best case scenario probably signifies more given the goals of the sanction. Similarly, when we look at the shares of oil and gas revenues in GDP and in overall federal revenues, they seem to be in decline since 2022. So 2022 itself saw some increase, mostly again due to high oil prices in the share of oil and gas revenue, both as percentage of GDP and as percentage of overall federal revenue. But in 2023, there's almost a 10% decline in how much oil and gas revenues are coming in GDP terms, as well as in the overall federal government revenue terms. These are, of course, based on data provided by the Russian government. So it has to be taken with a little bit of caution, of course, right? But the general conclusion is consistent with more independent analysis. For example, looking at more fine-grained data that's based on customs and vessel and marine traffic, for example, that shows this bump right after February 2022. And there's this continued decline in the amount of export revenues Russian government is receiving. So one factor that Russia has going for itself is its national wealth fund, right? It has this fiscal cushion that it can fall back on in face of sanctions, and as revenues continues to decline. It is a sizable fund. So in 2021, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, the size of this fund stood at almost 12% of the GDP and at about 63% of the federal government revenue. In the last couple of years, we see a decline that's not seen in Russian like recent 10-year history, at least in how it dealt with negative revenue shocks in this type of shrinking. So at the end of 2023, for example, this fund equaled about 8% of the GDP of Russia and about 42% of the federal government revenue. So there are signs that the cushion that Russia falls back on in case of negative revenue shocks is declining as well. Okay, so how is the government dealing with the situation of slowly, incrementally, but still declining federal revenues? Let's look at first whether it's increasing production. Supposedly, or in theory, it can be an easy way to make up for this lost revenue. You have the facilities, you can just tell your industry to increase production, but that's usually not the case, not only for Russia, but generally countries that produce oil at this point most of them are close to capacity and they're limited by existing technology. So since 2004, for example, on average, oil producers have not experienced more than 5% of production fluctuation, and that applies to Russia as well. So most of Russia's oil is extracted from what's called the brownfield, that's limited by existing technology. And when Russia faced fiscal difficulties in 2009 and 2015, it managed to increase its production at most by 1.5% and to 1.3%. When we look at the figures for production as well, it seems like oil production is holding steady, but gas production is declining, and this is mostly because of the difficulty that gas exporters have to redirect gas as an export, right? Oil can be shipped to different destinations, whereas gas, you need the infrastructure to move it from Russia to different destinations. So in 2023, Russia is basically producing gas at a level that's comparable to 1970s. How about government expenditure, right? So this is in some ways, there's a clear answer. Russia is engaging in a very expensive, aggressive war. So of course, the government expenditure would go up. But beyond Russia, when we look at other oil and gas-rich countries as well, it's very difficult to cut expenditure in a significant and consistent level to make up for the negative revenue shocks. And that's because of what we call spending effect. So resource-dependent countries generally, when times are good, money is coming in, they go on a form of spending spree, right? They buy supporters for the regime. They have extensive redistributive programs. So it becomes part of reality of being a resource-dependent country to have to continue spending more. So even if Russia wasn't engaged in a war and expending significant amount of resources in the war, this is a very difficult outcome. So consistently, I find that it's difficult for countries to just cut expenditure. When we look at the numbers for the federal budget, we see that in orange line here, the trend is up significantly since 2021, right? So we see that the government is spending much more than its usual expenditure, even in terms or in percent in share of annual revenues. We see that between 2021 and 2022, there was a huge jump, and that's staying constant. So when the numbers for this year comes in, it would be interesting to see how that trend continues. Another thing that we see looking at the data is reallocation of funds to the military at the expense of other sectors. One thing that makes it difficult for us to analyze the budgetary data particularly is starting spring 2022, the Russian government stopped sharing the subchapters of government expenditure. So the latest date we have the actual expenditure data is in 2021. But they publish how much they're planning to spend for the next budgetary years, which is usually an underestimate of what actually ends up being spent. So here we see, for example, national defense in 2021, about 14.4% of the overall expenditure was going to the national defense sector, and that's planned to go up to almost 30% in 2024. Again, the assessment is that these are underestimates, right? National security and law enforcement, it saw a significant increase in share of expenditure in this field from 9.4 to 12.3%. It's supposed to go down in 2024. When we look at some other sectors that the budget for which has been slashed, national economy is one. So in 2021, about 27% of the government expenditure was going for social policy, whereas in 2024, we're looking at about 10.6%. Social policy is going from 27% to 21%. General state issues, we're looking at from 7.2 to about 5.7%. So this suggests that very much in line what we would expect, the government is really prioritizing expenditure in national defense and keeping this war going. Another interesting question I had regarding the budgets were what's happening to the transfers to the regions, right? So we know that the regions are playing important roles for supplying conscripts, managing the conscription system, enforcing the demand for conscription, and so on. So is the central government giving more to the regions was the question that I had. So when we look at the planned transfers to regions, in 2022, there was about 10% increase planned. In 2023 for 5, though, the planned numbers are going down significantly. So between 22 and 23, for example, about 18% decline was planned for regions, further 8% decrease in 2024, another 14% decrease in 2025. What actually happened, so this data we have from the regional government's resources. So in 2023, despite having planned about 18% decrease in regional transfers, the budget went over by 25%, which I think is a significant amount going to the regions. And I have recently acquired the regional numbers. So I'm looking forward to doing further analysis to see what type of regions are actually receiving more versus less. Okay. So so far, natural resource production is not going up. Expenditure is not being cut. What about the third and fourth option, right? So divesting from the private sector. This seems to be the main long-term strategy for the Russian government happening to compensate for the lost revenues from natural resources. So even before 2022, Russian government had significant interference in the business sector, and it is a very important player. But exit of Western companies provided even more incentive for the government and the affiliated elites to increase government interference in the private sector. One reason is that when Western companies left, vast amounts of assets were left behind that were basically up for grabs, and the government has stepped in many cases to reallocate these assets. Also, Russia now being an isolated economy, isolated country, it really cut down the options available to a regular businessman, right? It's not business as usual. You have to engage with government in order to participate in lucrative deals and make profits, basically. So government has, for instance, established legal rights to dictate some of the business decisions supposed to be made by the private sector. It can dictate prices of certain goods, even though it's produced by the private sector. If a company's employees are called to conscription, the company is required to basically negotiate with the government, especially if they have a large number of conscription age employees. The government also nationalized many domestic notable firms, the latest of which is Yuri Antipov's share of Ethanol in Chelyabinsk. So in February of this year, basically the share that he owned, which is worth supposedly hundreds of millions of dollars, it was decided in a closed court that it's going to be taken by the government. And Putin have apparently visited the location a few days before this decision happened and criticized the firm for not complying with environmental regulations. And a few days later, he finds himself in closed court. But the official basis for this nationalization, for example, is illegal privatization in the 1990s. So it's likely that we're going to see more of this stepping in from the government and interference from the government in order to keep the federal budget sustainable. There are also reports that increase in personal and corporate tax rates are in the talks, and progressive tax system is being discussed as a priority for Putin's next term, is the talk. So if this ends up happening, individuals and corporations that are successful, that are more likely to be less dependent on the government, they're going to be taxed, and this tax revenue is likely to accrue to the federal budget. How about the last option? This is kind of the most ideal option, right? At least based on the experiences of the Russian region. Under this option, we should see the government prioritizing expanding the number of productive and profitable businesses so that they can tax them down the road. So this is a very painful, long-term, expensive road. But this is, again, if we consider the overall development of an entity, this is probably the most productive one. So do we see that happening? The answer is no, even though we see the overall importance of non-resource federal revenues growing. If we look at the nominal numbers here in orange, this is non-oil gas revenues flowing into the federal budget. If we look at it as percentage of overall government revenues, it was on the decline until 2022, but in 2023, it climbed up. However, one specific feature of the Russian federal tax system is that most of this tax money is coming from value-added tax rather than from corporate and individual income taxes. The reason why is that the Russian tax system is structured in a way that most of this corporate and income taxes accrue to the regional budget. So one of the reasons we saw the oil and gas regions trying to support businesses, improve their business environment after the centralization of natural resource revenues in 2002 is that they had this fiscal instrument in their hands that was going for them. So they knew if they increased the number of companies that they were taxing, for instance, they would make more money. So here we compare in orange the amount of money that's going to the regional budgets from corporate tax versus in blue money that's going to the federal budget. And what we see here is that significantly more of the corporate and individual income, in this case, significantly more of the corporate profit tax is actually accruing to the regional budget. So this makes the government uninclined to expand its tax base, because even if it was operating under normal conditions and tried to expand tax base, this money would go to the regional government. So the federal tax system is set up in a way where the most politically accountable fiscal tools are in the regional government's hands, but we know that regional governments are weak vis-a-vis the central government, right? So there is this misalignment of incentives that's adding to the disincentive of the federal government to go for this option. So in conclusion, Russia is not doing these first two options. Russia is more likely to end up in the third outcome, where the private sector is very weak and the state is very strong. Expanding tax base is not an attractive option because of the federal tax system. Also, it comes with that political threat, right? You may support businesses and make them good taxpayers, but you can never be sure that they won't become good challengers as well. But one implication of my book project is that time horizon can matter in this context. Whose time horizon, what determines it, how do we measure it, are open questions. But my argument is that resilience and expression of commitment to the effectiveness of oil and gas sanctions, for instance, and conveying the message that sanctions are here to stay, their attempts to reduce Russia's natural resource revenues are here to stay, can tip the scale for the federal government of Russia when they're considering the third and the fourth option from the framework. So I'm going to stop here and get into discussion.
We're gonna try to kick off the discussion with a question, and I have a bunch of things I'd love to ask you about, but I'll pick up on the last point that you made, which is that your book project predicts that the expectations of revenue predicts which strategy they choose.
Mhm.
And it seems like your conclusion was that we should be more kind of assertive and more kind of transparent about the fact that this is going to be a long-term negative revenue shock. But wouldn't the implication, according to your book, be that that might incentivize the Russian government to make more economically productive decisions in terms of trying to grow its tax base? And isn't one implication potentially of your book is that we want to keep a lot of uncertainty about how long this revenue shock is going to last, because that induces really destructive behavior on the part of the government, where they start predating firms and becoming more interventionist because they just don't know how much revenue is going to come around the story. And by tipping our hand and saying, like, this is the new normal, we're creating an opportunity for the Russian state to adapt and then potentially be more stable along down the line. But if we induce more volatility in the oil price or more uncertainty, we might elicit some more self-destructive behavior.
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that Russia, now being isolated from global economy, there's only so much that the state can predate on when it comes to the private sector. So again, unfortunately, given what's happening in Ukraine, the time period we're looking at and the time horizon we're looking at is probably going to be longer, but at the end of the day, there's only so much the Russian government can can engage in terms of taking resources away from the private sector. So lasting through that is probably a good idea to incentivize them. Okay, we have to do these productive things so that the economy is sustainable, so that we have more to take away, either through taxes or corruption or nationalization, is the kind of intuition behind the argument.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So let's open this up. If we could just introduce yourself, so we know who you are, and any questions for me? Yes.
I'm Harley Balzer, emeritus at Georgetown University. Thank you. This is fascinating. I guess one small thing and one big thing. The small one is 2022, the sanctions weren't really supposed to be operational. And so using it for comparison is a little bit tricky. And I think you know that, but it really ought to be emphasized. The bigger question is, what you didn't mention, the oil price dropped in 2008. And it's an interesting omission, given that that's where there really seems to have been a break point. I mean, Kudrin has published the data that from 2000 to 2008, they took in about $900 billion worth of oil and gas revenues, and they grew at almost, a little over 7% a year on average. And after that, the next 5 years or so, they took in $1.3 trillion, and they grew at maybe 1%. There's one Russian scholar at Higher School of Economics who said that the whole growth since 2008 has been 15% total. So, is there a reason why you didn't want to make that part of it?
Yes. So in my book project, so I focused on 2002 and jumped to 2014, right? The reason why I didn't include the 2008 in my case study was that the 2008 shock applied not only to the oil and gas regions, but everybody was affected. It wasn't only the oil gas regions that ran out of money. So on the national level, all the significant amounts of money was coming in. It was being saved. It was being used on various projects. But in the book project, from an empirical perspective, right, I want to have a shock that affected the oil and gas regions more than others, so that I can clearly identify the effect of that shock on the different outcomes I'm interested in. After actually preparing for this talk, I think I'm going to have a chapter in the book that's focused on the broad national experience of Russia, and that's, I think, where the 2008 will come in.
Thank you.
Lauren McCarthy, UMass Amherst, visiting here at GW. I'm wondering, from sort of looking at what has happened, whether you think that Russia has misjudged what kind of time horizons this war is going to create for them. Just in the fact that they seem to be taking this sort of the short-term time horizon path and not the long-term time horizon path. And I think we all think that this is going to be a long time horizon, but Russia seems to be choosing, you know, according to the way that you saw the oil and gas regions, they seem to be choosing the short-term time horizon path. And I'm wondering if you just think that they've misjudged.
I think there's definitely a misjudgment involved in not only when it comes to dealing with the repercussions of the sanctions, but in terms of how quick they thought the war was going to be, and probably the extent of sanctions as well. They knew the EU would care, they knew US would care, but I think the extent of sanctions was probably miscalculated to begin with. And I think there's a kind of path dependency in there as well. Once you go down the path of state interfering and nationalizing and so on, it's difficult to stop that. So even if the realization that it's going to be a long-term shock came later, I think switching between strategies probably is costly for Russia and other governments as well.
Also welcome people joining us online to feel free to contribute questions. But in the meantime, anyone else in the audience have anything they want to ask? Yes, please.
Yes, Marjorie Mandelstone Balzer, Georgetown University. There was a really tantalizing moment where you talked about part of Russia's expenditures being to buy supporters of the regime. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, especially in regard to the center and regional politics.
So I think one of the, so at the time when centralization of natural resource revenue happened in 2002, it was seen as more of a fiscal decision. So the idea was we're going to take away from these wealthy oil, gas rich regions and redistribute it, equalize it to giving resources to poorer regions, right? That seemed to be the justification that seemed to, at least the people I talked to, seem to have initially bought it. But what became clear later was it was part of a goal to centralize power, right? You take away the resources, you take away the power. And that's, of course, that was soon followed by Putin's decision to replace the regional governor elections by appointments. So it's that now, with the benefit of hindsight, it seems to have been part of a larger attempt to centralize power, and it worked greatly. So one of the oil-rich regions, Tatarstan, for example, it used to have a lot of autonomy in terms of its ability to negotiate with the central government in the 1990s. It was basically, some I would argue, an independent state of its own. But once this resource revenue was centralized, then they had very little option but to be more compliant with Moscow, be more compliant with Putin, for example. Still, there are different levels of political support, political dependence across the regions, but overall oil and gas regions became more dependent as a result of this centralization. And in general, it's, I think, even if we kind of look at only the national level, generally countries that have oil and gas, they spend a lot of money on citizens as well as elites in order to purchase support. That's part of the resource curse, right? It kind of keeps you stagnant in a state where you have to keep spending this money or take other actions to strengthen your military and so on. So this is not something we only see in Russia. It's kind of generally what we observe related to a lot of natural resource revenues.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. Henry Hale, political science here at GW.
Great.
I guess I was just curious if you've looked at other kind of oil-rich countries under sanctions, and kind of how your findings compare, maybe like Venezuela, or something like that.
So I'm not looking at Venezuela. I have a case on Mongolia, but again, not under sanctions. That's why I started the talk with saying that my focus is broadly on the government action rather than sanctions themselves. But preparing for this talk definitely sparked a lot of interest and possibilities to bring in other countries. I have a chapter that uses cross-national data on oil-rich countries since 1960s and show that economic freedom scores in these countries, for example, increase following a decline in natural resource revenue. In the case of Mongolia, I kind of go into the politics of how do governments try to come up with solutions to the fiscal problem. So the kind of similar argument carries through the book.
Were you surprised when the government articulated this new increase in taxes? You kind of attributed it to just wanting to raise money for the regional governments, but this is pretty landmark in the history of Russian political economy, that this is the first increase in two of the taxes in over 20 years. My sense was that it is to kind of increase the tax base. You put it in the depressed business category, but
yes,
a lot of regions are going to be in economic pain coming forward, and this allows them to compensate a bit for the deficits that they're going to be running. And there is some talk about the Russian central government taking on a lot of the regional debt and bailing them out. I was curious, when you saw the tax increase, what was your immediate reaction to how that fit into this theory?
So I think like at this point, my understanding is that there are like some reports of it, whether that's going to happen or not is actually not clear at this moment. I did put it in more of overtaxing the business, taking resources away from the private sector rather than expanding their tax base. And that's mostly based on an understanding that this is going to increase the federal share of the corporate and personal income tax rather than the regional shares. It is my understanding, but I think at this point we're not sure. So if that's the case, I think it's more of the federal government just expanding its reach to the pockets of regular businesses and entrepreneurs. If it's related to the regional government's share, I think then maybe the way you're thinking, it makes more sense. It's instead of bailing these governments out, just give them higher percentage of revenue coming from that. But I think we will find out.
Well, we see it actually in print.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
On this, there's an article on Kommersant yesterday about 8 regions having been identified where the governor is now going to be personally responsible for avoiding going over the budget and demanding more transfers. 4 of them are the 4 new territories in Ukraine, which tells you something about the corruption levels there. And the other 4 are Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, and Tiva. And in all of these, the government had to bail them out in 23, and they've said the governor is now personally responsible. I assume he's going to have to use his corruption fund to balance if they go over the budget again.
And I think that again, the interesting question for me with that is how far can they go? Can they actually, will they come up with a long-term system where regional governors are personally responsible for regional debts? To me, that's difficult to build and implement. And I think that kind of speaks to the desperation of the government probably, and that highlights the fact that time horizons are important, I think.
I think it even more as the governor now being really required to crack down on corruption.
Mhm.
That they've got to be far more responsible in how the money gets spent. Or else, you know, he might be impoverished, but he'd also lose his job pretty quickly.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I hadn't seen that article yet. Yeah.
Yeah, Chris Kochan with the Eurasian Studies program here. I was really struck in your presentation by the decline in social policy spending from 27% of national income to 21%. Now, in any Western country, you'd have riots in the streets, and obviously that's not happening. But I'd be interested in how far you think that decrease in social spending can go, that the government will press and that the population will tolerate.
So the fact that Russia is becoming increasingly more authoritarian, people are scared, right? So probably there's a lower threshold in the US versus Russia. How far will that go? I think it may go quite deep. So one feature of Russian businesses, for example, is that the government has a lot of say about the social policies and provisions of a particular firm, right? So you can't, you may be forced to keep some employees if a certain number of employees, if you know, during times of economic difficulty, for instance. Some argue, for instance, this is Putin's cushion against economic crisis in general. Why don't we see Russia going through economic crisis, but Putin stays? And some argue that it's the fact that state has this direct involvement and power over firms' decisions to regulate its human resources, basically, right? So that may come as a helpful resource for the government to have it keep going. And another thing is a lot of the social programs are actually coming from the regional budgets as well. So that may give the central government some incentive to keep the regions afloat and open opportunities for them to increase their revenues, because they are a major player when it comes to social policy. So I really can't say how low, but I think it can go lower. Yeah.
Thank you.
Additional questions? I've got a lot more, but I don't want to dominate.
Any questions from the online audience?
They've been suspiciously quiet. They're there in numbers, but not-
Late in the day.
it is
so-
late in the day. Lauren.
So thinking about what happened in 2002, when the regions kind of innovated to make it easier for business, do you see that possibility under the current circumstances where maybe some regions who are maybe being held to account in different ways about their budgets or whatever, that they might be able to innovate? Or is the government's hand too strong at this moment in the economy, and the government too worried about too much independence, regionally speaking, to allow that to move forward?
So the regional governments do have policy tools if they want to make businesses easy for them. But I think the fact that Russia is isolated and cut off from global economy, that makes it that much difficult, or that less credible for businesses to succeed and pay me time. Like that scenario was, it was probably a very credible possible scenario before 2022, but now you again need to have really long time horizon to expect businesses to flourish, expect investments to come in, and eventually start paying the regional governments taxes. And in this situation where the regional government's political incentives are so kind of far removed from economic performance, beyond maybe meeting the budget goals, is not helpful for them at all. And even if this was the case even before 2022, where the regional governors basically, why would you bother supporting investment if your responsibility and your political path is related to the central government? So probably not, but I've heard some people talk about some Russians are under the impression that maybe this is propaganda, but they're under the impression that the economy is actually freer now. So like Russia is a island of, like it's an island of itself with its own economy, big enough to produce everything it needs. So there's more freedom. So there are these types of perceptions by entrepreneurs there. It's probably more of an impression rather than reality, though. Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for sharing your research this afternoon with all of us. Thank you all for joining us. This is our last New Voices of the academic year. I know it's already April.
Yeah.
But we look forward to another set of visitors, visiting scholars next year. I hope you can join us for that. But thank you very much. Thank you again, Dink.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.